Risk management is a more realistic term than safety. It implies that hazards are ever present, that they must be identified, analysed, evaluated and controlled, or rationally accepted. Amazing words from a man who became better known as Mr. Aviation Safety, Jerome Lederer, NASA's first director of manned flight safety, and later the founding director of the Flight Safety Foundation and its director for some 20 years. But dear friends and colleagues, this is exactly why we are here. Aviation is a hazard-rich environment, and these hazards are ever present. Our task, whether we work in industry or government, in the air or on the ground, is to proactively identify, analyse, evaluate and control these ever-present hazards, or to rationally accept them. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. And for some, it's a very early morning indeed. Welcome to the Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group Webinar Series 2021. After a most challenging year in 2020 and the difficult decision to cancel the forum last year, in 2021 we made the choice that what these forums provide is more necessary in a time of pandemic than ever before, and it simply must go ahead. Hence, the 3 webinars you'll experience over the next 3 weeks. And many of you will have seen the recent and harrowing footage from only a few days ago of the Spirit Air A320neo high-speed abort and a subsequent fire due bird strike on takeoff out of Atlantic City. A very vivid reminder of exactly why we are here. Thank you for your patronage, and thank you too to the fantastic lineup of industry speakers we have who will be sharing their insights and thoughts over the next 3 weeks. Today is the first of the 3 webinars, and over the next 3 weeks, you'll hear from 21 industry experts on a range of topics relating to our broad theme of research and innovation. Today's webinar will focus on that theme. Webinar 2 will take a closer look at the impacts of COVID-19. And the 3rd webinar will look at various case studies of wildlife hazard management collaboration. As the chair of the AAWHG and on behalf of an amazingly dedicated team, we are truly delighted to bring to you these events over the next 3 weeks. The team have been tireless in their organisation and of all details, big and small. But don't forget, on the right-hand side of your screen is a drop-down menu for live questions and answers. There you can type your questions, you can vote for questions that are already posted, and you can comment on each of the sessions as we go. We'll be addressing all the questions at the conclusion of the presentations on each day, hopefully today at around 10:45 to 10:50 Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time. The Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group is the primary aviation wildlife hazard management reference body in Australia and is a key working group of the Australian Aviation State Safety Program. Since 2003, industry professionals from across all domains have met regularly with the sole focus being better knowledge, analysis and awareness of managing wildlife hazards in aviation. Now, some 20 years later, we have some fantastic resources available for all. Please check out the AAWHG website, look up the resources tab, and there you'll find links to all sorts of relevant information. Especially look out for the recommended practices. The recommended practices are a constant work in progress, and we are in the process of continuously adding and updating them all the time. So please refer back to there often. Recently, the AAWHG team has been extremely humbled and honoured to have been requested by the International Civil Aviation Organisation's Asia Pacific office to develop and co-host a webinar series specifically for them. There have been 4 separate webinars over the last 12 months, with the final one being delivered in mid-September just gone. These sessions have put the AAWHG on the world stage, and being involved is fantastic recognition of the standard of work and the level of knowledge and expertise within the AAWHG and the effectiveness of our National Wildlife Strike Committee, something we should all be truly proud of. While it is openly disclosed to all that my day-to-day employer is the Civil Aviation Safety Authority in Australia, the AAWHG, and indeed my role as the chair of the Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group, is completely independent from CASA. In fact, the group is wholly independent in function, but extremely well supported by all of our employers, industry and government alike. We are a group of volunteers who want only to make a positive difference to aviation safety. With aviation safety very much in the front of mind, it is my extreme pleasure now to welcome our first guest and to formally open this 2021 AAWHG Webinar series. Pip Spence commenced as the Chief Executive Officer and Director of Aviation Safety for CASA on the 17th of May 2021. Before joining CASA, Pip was a Chief Operating Officer and Deputy Secretary for the Arts at the Department of Transport, Infrastructure, Regional Development and Communications. Before that, she was the Deputy Secretary for Transport, and in this role, Pip was responsible for aviation and airport policy and other program matters. Pip has a long association with the AAWHG, but I won't steal her thunder on that. Pip, handing over.
For the opportunity to make the opening remarks today. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today. For me, that is the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This series of webinars is a great opportunity for people with expertise in wildlife hazard management to come together and share their knowledge and experiences. So I thank you all very much for taking part. CASA is a very proud supporter of the Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group. It presents real risks to aviation of all shapes and sizes, from large transport operations to weekend sports flying. Data from the Australian Transport Safety Bureau on bird strikes shows well over 1,000 and sometimes close to 2,000 occurrences per year. The number of animal strikes is smaller, averaging about 30 a year. We also know from ATSB data that the number of strikes involving a bird ingested into an engine of an air transport aircraft has risen in recent years. Estimates put the worldwide costs of strikes at more than $1 billion a year. And we know wildlife strikes can cause fatal accidents. This means wildlife hazard management is very much both a safety and economic issue, and risks must be successfully mitigated. COVID has hit aviation hard. Even with how we think about wildlife hazards has to adjust. For those sectors where aviation is quieter, wildlife risks are manifesting themselves somewhat differently. Birds and animals will be finding aerodromes and parked aircraft more attractive places of refuge. This means aircraft operators, pilots, and aerodrome operators and staff must be thinking about changed wildlife risks and how these need to be managed. The usual strategies may not be enough, and the management of these COVID-related risks may need to be changed, which of course underlines the importance of the Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group and this series of webinars. I'm particularly pleased to see the second day of the series covers COVID-related issues in depth. A few people in aviation might think about wildlife hazards as a set of risks primarily managed by aerodromes. But air operators, flight crew, and air traffic controllers and others need to understand the risks and the role they can play in successful mitigation. I've heard the story told of an aircraft approaching a major Australian aerodrome where a flock of birds was observed by the pilot of another aircraft waiting on the ground. This information was shared with the arriving aircraft. So despite being cleared to land, the crew of the arriving aircraft decided to hold off for a few minutes until they could be more certain of the potential bird hazard had passed through the airspace. Pushing ahead with a landing when there was an identified risk would not have been a sound decision, although likely one could have been considered. After all, there are time and cost pressures to keep to the schedule. These pilots and air traffic controllers did a great job of understanding the risk and working together to manage it successfully. And this example highlights that wildlife risks are a shared responsibility and we need to share the outcomes. This group has recommended practices for the training of aircraft operators and pilots in the tools, techniques and procedures available to minimise the likelihood of a wildlife strike occurring and of minimising the consequence if a strike does occur. This is such an important initiative, and I know more work on recommended practices is being done. One of CASA's central roles is to set aviation standards through regulations. The rules relating to wildlife hazard management are set out in Part 139 of the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations. Other roles for CASA are to foster awareness of the importance of safety, communicate about safety, and encourage a high level of acceptance of safety. The group grew from a meeting between CASA, the ATSB and the Australasian Aviation Ground Safety Council in 2003. And I'm pleased that since 2003, the group has met regularly and continues to be very active. The membership includes a wide range of representatives from the aviation community, both individuals and organisation. In 2010, the group was formally recognised as the primary aviation wildlife hazard management reference body in Australia. Importantly, the group fulfils Australia's commitment to have a national bird strike committee, as recommended by ICAO. Central work of the group includes raising industry and public awareness of aviation wildlife hazards, the associated risks and their management, and also promoting best practices in aviation wildlife hazard management. You also provide a forum for stakeholders to discuss aviation wildlife hazard management and risk reduction strategies and actions. One of the keys to the success of the group is that you bring a wide group of people and organisations together and promote the open sharing of information and expertise. This means you are truly an organisation driven by the aviation community for the benefit of everyone with a stake in aviation. While CASA is a great supporter of the group, we value the fact that it is independent and operates at arm's length from our day-to-day regulatory activities. And as Ash has already mentioned, as well as being independent, your group is run by volunteers. The executive team give up their time and effort in support of the group, and the organisations who employ these people kindly allow them to take time away from their primary employment duties. These are valuable commitments by highly skilled and knowledgeable individuals and organisations in aviation and related fields. I'm proud that at this time, Ash McAlpine is chair of the group, and I want to thank Ash and everyone on the executive for their hard work. It is through your efforts that aviation safety is enhanced and encouraged. The importance of your work is reflected in the fact that the group is recognised internationally as a leader in the field. Everyone taking part in this event understands that aviation safety is the outcome of successful risk management. All of us work in various and complementary ways to ensure that known risks continue to be mitigated and emerging risks are identified and treated as quickly as possible. We are all part of the National Aviation Safety System, and in Australia, we are rightly proud of that system. The system is in many ways alive, never static or stuck in the past, which means we all must be alive to changes to the aviation system and adjust our thinkings and actions as required. The travelling public relies on us to be dynamic in risk management so that they can rest easy as they start to resume travelling safely. This series of webinars will make a contribution to the continued delivery of safe skies for all. So please enjoy the presentation and, of course, share the knowledge that you gain. Thank you.
Thanks, Pip, and thanks for those very supportive words in opening this webinar series. Your time is much appreciated. Now, for those of you who have been referring closely to our program and the schedule of events, probably noting that next up we were due to be hearing from the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History and from Dr. Rebecca Johnson and Dr. Carla Dove. We received some quite sad news over the weekend, and due to a personal emergency, the team from the US are unable to actually join us today. Our thoughts and best wishes are with them at this time, and we truly hope and intend to actually bring you their material in the future, possibly as a separate standalone webinar, maybe in the new year. What we have got for you though is I think will be an equally rich and equally interesting presentation from a good close friend of the AAWHG, Dr. Matthew Lott from the Australian Museum. Dr. Lott works in the Australian Centre for Wildlife Genomics. I'm sure he'll do a little bit to introduce himself in a moment, but I think you'll find the material that he's got to present for us today quite captivating and fits in perfectly with what the Smithsonian team were going to talk about with the interface of science into wildlife hazard management and also specifically the impact of DNA on wildlife hazard risk assessment. Dr. Lott, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Ash, for that very generous introduction. I don't really have too much to add to that, so we may as well jump into the presentation. And what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of the way that research at museums can enhance wildlife management at aerodromes, which I guess is maybe a collaboration that wouldn't necessarily occur to a lot of people. So I'm sure this isn't news to any of you, but collisions between wildlife and aircraft, which are collectively known either as bird strikes or wildlife airstrikes, depending on who you're talking to, are a major threat to the global aviation industry. And while the true costs of bird strikes to commercial airline operators are often very difficult to calculate, conservative estimates suggest an annual loss of about $1.2 billion due to a combination of damage, precautionary delays, and cancellations. And of course, in extreme cases, bird strikes can also have catastrophic consequences for public safety, with at least 500 lives and over 600 aircraft lost worldwide since 1912. So humans coming into contact with wildlife is a problem that we've been trying to manage since we first started putting planes in the air over 100 years ago. And that's kind of exemplified for me by this oil painting that I've included on the slides there that depicts a scene from the 1911 Paris to Madrid air race, where a French pilot, Eugene Gilbert, was attacked by an angry eagle while flying over the Pyrenees. And he was forced to hang out of the side of his open cockpit airplane and fire at it with his pistol in order to scare the bird off. So while encounters between wildlife and aircraft are not new phenomenon, clearly our techniques for managing those encounters have become much more sophisticated in the intervening 110 odd years. So to both preserve public safety and reduce financial losses, the International Civil Aviation Authority, as well as various national organizations, recommend that all aerodromes implement wildlife management programs to reduce the risk of bird strike events. So an important first step there is establishing which species are most commonly responsible for damaging aircraft. And that gives you a number of options for managing wildlife airstrike events. So this information can provide valuable insights into the size, behavior, and ecology of potentially problematic wildlife. And that in turn lets you develop more targeted and hopefully more successful management strategies. So species identification has been used to design avoidance programs, guide habitat management, and has even been used by engineers to assist in the creation of aircraft components like windscreens and engines that are more resilient to bird strikes. But one potential issue is that bird strike statistics continue to be based primarily on observation made by pilots and ground personnel, or on the occurrence of dead birds or other wildlife recovered from aerodromes. And while there's of course nothing intrinsically wrong with that, it can create records that are strongly biased towards the detection of larger and more easily recognizable species, which may not necessarily constitute the highest risk to the operation of commercial or military aircraft operators. And the other problem that we often run into is that the only remains that are often recovered following collisions between wildlife and aircraft are small smears of blood, feathers, or tissue, which are very, very hard to identify without a lot of very specialized expertise. Fortunately, though, birds and bats have been intensively studied using a wide range of different scientific techniques, and those techniques are increasingly being applied to enhance aviation safety. So this is just a bit of a brief history of what we call forensic ornithology, so basically applying scientific techniques to the study of wildlife airstrike events. And despite more recent advancements in the fields of molecular biology and genetics, the examination of feathers remains an important technique for identifying species involved in bird strike events. And that's because many microscopic characteristics of feathers, such as the barbs, barbules, nodes, pigmentation patterns, are highly unique to different groups of birds and can therefore provide valuable clues for species identification. So it's generally believed that the microscopic structure of bird feathers was first described by Asa Crawford Chandler, the man with the most British name in all of history, in 1916. But it's the ornithologist Roxy Colley-Laybourne, pictured on the bottom left there, who is generally credited with pioneering the study of forensic ornithology during her time at the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And her techniques are still widely used for routine bird species identifications from whole and fragmentary feather material. And the information that she's collected over the course of her career has contributed to significant improvements in both aircraft design and operational safety. So she's a very impressive scientist. Now, while they are still considered useful, a major drawback to feather-based species identification is that they are only feasible when the remains are reasonably intact. And the other obvious problem is that they're not going to be applicable to strikes involving bats or terrestrial wildlife. There don't tend to be a lot of feathers on deer, for example. So consequently, it's been estimated that as many as a quarter of all bird strikes are for species that we physically cannot identify by examination of remains. And in those cases, biochemical or DNA-based identifications can be far more accurate. So there's a number of different techniques that have been developed for extracting structural proteins like keratin from bird feathers and analyzing them in a process called electrophoresis, which is basically where you just separate the molecules based on their size and electrical charge. And comparative studies done in the 1970s indicate that some combinations of feather keratin molecules are species-specific and can therefore be used as an identification technique following bird strike events. But things like blood and tissue remained unidentifiable until the advent of DNA sequencing technologies. So in 2003, a technique known as DNA barcoding was proposed as a standardized method for species identification. And put simply, DNA barcoding works by comparing a short fragment of DNA, which is sourced from a specific gene or genes, to a reference library, which consists of DNA sequences that represent that same gene in a wide variety of different animals. And in theory, an individual can be identified by comparing its DNA to the sequences in the database in much the same way that an item in a supermarket can be identified by scanning its barcode. So DNA barcoding provides an accurate and cost-effective means of identifying bird strike samples, and it's particularly valuable in light of the current global decline in morphological identification expertise. That is, unfortunately, a bit of a dying art. All of which brings me to the role that museum collections can play in enhancing aviation safety. So museums like the Australian Museum in Sydney, which, as Ash mentioned, is where I'm based, not only has a range of taxonomic experts, we also have access to enormous reference collections, which in our case consist of nearly 20 million objects, most of which have been expertly identified. And they might be variously stored as dried specimens, like those koalas in the top right there. They could be dried pin specimens, like those beetles and butterflies, or they could be what we call wet collections, which are stored in ethanol, like the fish and eels on the bottom left there. And I'll get to why museum collections are an important resource for aviation safety shortly. But first, I thought it might be worth taking a minute just to introduce you in a little bit more detail to the organisation I work for. So the Australian Centre for Wildlife Genomics is a group based out of the Australian Museum in Sydney. And we are a NATA accredited DNA laboratory and biological tissue collection. So NATA is just an authority that provides independent assurance of technical competence through, and I'm just reading off their website here, a proven network of best practice industry experts for customers who require confidence in the delivery of their products and services. Basically, it's just a qualification we have to show that we are experts and we know what we're talking about. So it gives a sort of guarantee of quality to our clients. And we also manage the Australian Museum tissue collection. So tissue and DNA from around 100,000 specimens are maintained in -80-degree freezers, which create the optimal conditions for long-term DNA storage. And that's allowed us to develop a comprehensive molecular reference database of bird and bat specimens from across Australia, which we can use to identify individuals involved in wildlife airstrike events. So I don't want this talk to be too much of an advertisement for our services specifically, because I don't necessarily think that's in the spirit of these webinars. But I am going to sort of walk you through our process of sort of analysing casework, because I think it does give quite an interesting insight into how the field of wildlife forensics operates and how that is directly applicable to managing wildlife airstrike events at aerodromes. So obviously it's not feasible for us to go out and collect samples from all the different aerodromes across Australia. So what we do is we provide sample collection kits to aerodrome operators free of charge. And that also includes instructions for best practice sample collection. So our main concern at the outset is always to ensure sterile and accurate sample collection, because poor technique can result in failed tests due to human or insect contamination of the sample. So we provide gloves, which I'm sure you would be wearing gloves anyway if you were going to be interacting with wildlife. And we suggest that you take care not to touch these sterile swabs to anything other than the sample that you're collecting, whether it's a blood spot, tissue remains, whatever. So we tend to find that fresh blood or flesh are the best samples for DNA analysis, but dried blood or feathers or hair can also give results. Generally, you find results drop off sort of directly proportional to how old and rotted the sample is. It is quite hard to get DNA out of old degraded samples. So the ideal sample from our perspective would contain blood or tissue on a swab, plus, if available, plucked feathers or hairs, or maybe a bit of tissue. So samples are double bagged in sealed plastic bags, along with an Australian Museum DNA identification request form, and multiple samples can be processed as part of the same request form. So to ensure best possible results, we also recommend that prior to DNA analysis, the samples are stored in either a fridge or a freezer to prevent tissue degradation. So once your samples arrive on our end, they are logged and assigned a unique case number, and then they're stored at -20 degrees Celsius until the sample is processed. So total genomic DNA is extracted from 2 separate sources from your sample. The primary source is taken from blood or tissue if available, and the secondary source is usually from a swab or feather quill or something like that. So all samples are processed under sterile conditions in a biological safety cabinet, which is shown on the top left there, which basically provides an enclosed, ventilated laboratory workspace for safely handling materials which may be contaminated with pathogens. And that's obviously a big concern here, considering a lot of the samples we're working with are bats, which have nasty things like lyssavirus and whatnot. Okay, so I'm not going to get too bogged down in the science of this, but just to give you sort of the 30,000-foot overview, the bulk of DNA-based wildlife forensic casework utilizes the mitochondrial genome rather than the nuclear genome. So I guess if most of you remember anything from high school biology, it's that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. What a lot of people may not remember is that your mitochondria actually have their own DNA, which is separate from the DNA that is contained in the nucleus of the cell. And because there are lots of copies of mitochondria in each cell, but only one nucleus, that means there is proportionately more mitochondrial DNA in each cell, which makes it very useful for trying to extract DNA from old or degraded samples. Also, for various reasons that we probably don't need to go into right now, mitochondrial DNA shows very little diversity within species, but very high diversity between species, which makes it very useful for identifying the animals that are involved in wildlife airstrike events. So there's a bunch of different genes in your mitochondrial genome. We tend to target a few specifically. So the cytochrome oxidase 1 or CO1 or the cytochrome B genes, just because they tend to be very well characterized across a wide range of taxa and are useful for species ID purposes. Okay, so again, not going to spend too much time on this, but just to give you a bit of an overview. As I said, we tend to start with very small amounts of sample, which don't have a huge amount of DNA. So the first thing we have to do is increase the amount of DNA that we're working with so that we have enough to study in detail. And to do that, we use a process called PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, which is a method that's widely used in molecular biology to rapidly make millions or billions of copies of a specific sequence of DNA. So PCR is essentially a three-step process. The first step, which is called denaturation, we basically heat up the DNA so that we break the hydrogen bonds that hold together that distinctive double helix shape, and we end up with two single strands of DNA. There is then what's called an annealing step, which is where we lower the temperature so that a short sequence of nucleic acid called a primer binds to those single strands of DNA. So the primer basically tells the molecular machinery that is going to create copies of our DNA which part needs to be copied. And then finally, the third step, which is called the extension or elongation, we raise the temperature again so that a special enzyme called the DNA polymerase comes through and starts creating copies of our DNA. And we'll repeat that process dozens of times. And at the start of each new cycle, we will have exponentially more DNA than we did at the start of the previous cycle. So that's how we create millions or billions of copies of this one specific region of DNA that we're interested in analyzing. And then once that's done, we'll sequence it, and we will be able to compare our DNA from our unknown specimen to a database of known specimens in that process of DNA barcoding that I mentioned earlier to establish a species ID. So there are various databases where researchers who are sequencing the DNA of different animals will store their data, which we can then compare our samples to. And you can see in this example here, samples 1 and 2, highlighted in black, are 100% identical to each other, therefore they're the same species. Same deal with samples 3 through 6, highlighted in red, they're 100% identical to each other, they're the same species. But the black group and the red group are only about 94% similar to each other, indicating that they are different species. Whereas sample 7, highlighted in yellow, is different to both the red and black species again. So if we're lucky, there'll be an exact match in pre-existing databases that will allow us to establish what species came into contact with the aircraft. In some cases, though, it might not be that neat because we won't necessarily have DNA from every single animal that a plane might come into contact with. So in those cases, we can construct what's called a phylogeny, which is shown on the left here. It's basically a tree. And what that is, it's an algorithm that recreates the evolutionary relationships between animals based on their DNA sequences. So if we don't know exactly what animal a DNA sequence came from, we can still plug it into this phylogeny and see, for example, what the most closely related species are. And that allows us to refine its identity at least down to, say, genus level, even if we can't get it to species. That's not a super common occurrence, though, because, as I said, we do have such an extensive database at the museum that we can usually get the ID down to a species level. And then the final stage is obviously reporting to the clients. This is just an example of our casework reporting form. It's all pretty self-explanatory, I think. The only thing I will mention is that there is an option whereby clients can elect to have us report the results to the ATSB at the same time they receive the results, just to save them the trouble of doing it. So just to give you a brief look at our some of the data from our airstrike database. So if you remember, I said at the start, most visual inspections of wildlife involved in airstrike events are sort of biased towards the detection of larger and more easily identifiable species. For the samples that we get DNA from, it tends to be the opposite. So you'll see here, these are the 10 most commonly identified species based on DNA analysis. The most common is Gould's wattlebat. The second most common is the Australasian pipit, followed by the Eurasian skylark. And they're all sort of small, nondescript, colorless kind of animals that either are very hard to identify based on remains or are going to completely disintegrate upon contact with something big like a Boeing 747, which also makes it very hard to identify them. So that's just an interesting dichotomy there, I guess. Okay, so most of this talk has focused on DNA-based identification of wildlife, but that's not the only kind of service we provide to aerodrome operators at the Australian Museum. We also often are called upon to do morphology-based identifications of insects. So you wouldn't necessarily think it, but many different types of insects, particularly Hymenoptera, so mud wasps, can represent a significant hazard to aircraft. So in Australia, we've got about 1,200 species of wasp, including 300 species of mud wasps and about 130 species of potter wasps. And what these guys like to do is the female wasp will predate a caterpillar and paralyze it with its stinger. It will then stuff the caterpillar into a burrow and it will lay an egg or its eggs on those caterpillars, which will then hatch and eat the caterpillar alive. So they're not the most pleasant little animals, but they're also kind of lazy. So they will dig burrows if none are available, but they're also perfectly happy to use pre-existing burrows, including ones that are obligingly created for them by humans. So one particular problem is that pitot tubes have proven to be kind of a ready-made nest for mud wasps. And there have been cases, one particularly bad case that happened with a plane flying out of the Dominican Republic, where a blocked pitot tube, where a wasp had put its larva into the tube and then sealed it up with mud, led to inaccurate speed readings on the aircraft. And basically the autopilot kept reducing the speed of that plane until it hit the stall speed. And by the time the pilot and co-pilot had realized what was happening, they'd already plowed into the ocean. And it's been estimated that there's no fewer than 11 similar cases involving large passenger carrying aircraft in Australia between the years of 2013 and 2015, where blocked pitot tubes by mud wasps have involved things like rejected takeoffs, air returns, and burning off excessive fuel to avoid overweight landings. So it can be quite a hazard. So as with larger fauna like birds or bats, it is useful for the aerodrome operator to know what species are responsible for blocking up pitot tubes. What makes it a little bit tricky is that pitot tubes tend to be heated electrically to melt ice, which has the side effect of charring any organic material that might be blocking those pitot tubes. And it's very hard to get DNA out of charred material. So that's why we have to tend to rely on morphological examination rather than DNA-based identification of insect remains. So here is just an example of some insect remains that we got out of a blocked pitot tube. So you can see on the right, that's the head of a wasp, which can contain informative morphological characteristics for establishing ID. And on the bottom there, we've also got remains of its caterpillar prey, which can be useful for establishing a species ID. So that's just another sort of way that museums can contribute to enhancing aviation safety. Getting towards the end of my talk here, so I just thought I'd briefly mention, in addition to our kind of routine services, which is basically just the DNA barcoding-based species IDs, the museum's also worked with various aerodrome operators on different research projects. One was using DNA-based analyses to look at the stomach contents of different birds that were culled around aerodromes in order to see if we could identify what they were feeding on and therefore what might be attracting them to those aerodromes in the first place. And also, because we keep comprehensive records of all our cases, by mining those records, we can sometimes identify data about the animals themselves. So their population structure, movement patterns, in the case of bats, how high they're flying and at what heights aircraft tend to come into contact with them, all of which might be potentially useful from a management perspective. So that's pretty much me done. If anyone does have any further inquiries about our services or anything that I've spoken about today, these are our contact details. So any inquiries can be sent to airstrike@australian.museum. And if you have any samples to send us, that is the shipping address down the bottom there. So with that, I'll just finish up and say thank you very much to Ash and the rest of the AAWHG for inviting me along to talk today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the presentations. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Matt, and fantastic presentation. Our sincere thanks too for coming in at relatively the last minute to help fill in. I'd never like to compare two science organisations, but the Australian Museum team are quite incredible. I reflect back to, I think it was about 2010 or so when I first started my relationship with your organisation, and you guys helped me out a lot in getting to the bottom of a problem that we were convinced was bats. And the airfield I was working at the time, we ended up finding out it was the Australian wood duck. The control of the two of those are vastly different in their applications. So very much cornerstone of our risk management back then. Thanks, Matt. We'll move on with our program now. And the next speaker is Mr. Bill Rutherford. He's an ornithologist from Ornithological Technical Services, OTS. And Bill will be talking to us on new techniques for bird counts at Auckland Airport and also audio monitoring. You'll hear from Bill a little bit later on as well on another topic, but for now, handing over to Bill to talk to us about his experience at Auckland Airport.
Hi everyone, thanks Ash. Welcome from Perth. It's still early in the morning here, and welcome to the Noongar Nation, the traditional owners of Southwestern Australia. We're going to talk briefly, I'm going to talk briefly about this relatively new methodology that's been used in ornithology for the last 10 years or so, or a bit longer, which is audio recording. It seems like an obvious thing to do, but it's yet to be rolled out properly at airports, and we've been finding some useful applications of this technology with regards to some of the things we have to do at Auckland and one or two of the other airports that we're looking at. Just quickly running through some of the introductory slides here. We all know about high risk species. It's not by chance that we've chosen those two species to talk about, the Canada goose and black swan, both of which have been introduced to Auckland, New Zealand. Canada geese have yet to figure largely in Australia, although I know a few years back a couple turned up in New South Wales, which were from the feral New Zealand population. And we're all aware of black swans and the hazards they pose. Oh, full screen it, sorry. Is that better? Sorry, guys. But some of the questions that typically we like to ask around monitoring and getting to the bottom of managing hazards is, with these high-risk species, where in an airfield they might occur, what time of day, are they roosting overnight, when do they cross flight paths, how often, where to and from, and is there a regular pattern? And this kind of stuff can be difficult to answer. Primarily because of the constraints on budget that this puts on, the amount of time things like that take, as we're all aware, can lead to that kind of work not being done effectively at airports. And the reasons there are constraints is due to the large home range of a lot of those big species. So the ranges are not necessarily constrained to the airfield. They won't live permanently on the airfield. They'll live in at least out to the 13 kilometre zone, if not more. They often transit or visit at night, okay, and you need an awful lot of data to be able to produce a management plan targeting individual species. So one solution that we're working with now is what we call ARUs. Okay, and these are automated audio recording units. Okay, relatively inexpensive. That's exactly what they look like. Probably, I don't know, 250 mil by 250 mil, and the battery packs in them last several weeks. Okay. So they're eminently programmable, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. First of all, though, we need to have a look at the bigger picture around audio recording and wildlife and understand what we're up against here. Traditionally, biologists and ornithologists would use handheld recorders and microphones, as those pictured in the slide at the top right there. That's a parabolic reflector, the strange round-looking device, and there's a handheld device that were actually developed for the music industry. And they've been slowly adapted to use for wildlife recordings. However, these automated audio recording units are clearly very different in that they're passive as opposed to active. So in the traditional ways of recording wildlife, you'd actually go out and try and record wildlife. These automated audio recording units are designed just to be fitted onto structures or left out in the field. And they come with a tiny little computer in them, which you can see there in the left. And you can program these to do whatever you want, really. Traditionally, what people do with them is program them so that they turn on an hour or so before sunset and turn off around sunrise. So they've got a light sensitive cell in them as well. So they're pretty nifty little bits of kit. That little computer can do quite a bit of different techniques and things like that, so that we can program to do more or less what we want. However, they've never been used in the aviation context that we are aware of, and this may well be the first project of its kind, and I suspect it probably is, and we'll understand that in a little bit. We'll run through some pros and cons of these bits of kit, and we need to understand that properly to understand the constraints on them. Obviously, you need sound to be able to record sound to work out what wildlife it is that you're working with. So this sound recording equipment works obviously best on vocal species. Okay, so things like great cormorants, perhaps, or wedge-tailed eagles might not be as vocal, but waterfowl, geese, ducks, and things like that certainly are. The other constraint with them is that it's difficult to count the actual number of birds or wildlife that are making the noise. Okay, you can have a crack at it from your screen, and we'll look at that in a moment. But it's not as effective as a visual count. But bear in mind, we're probably doing this over night time, so visual counts might be difficult. And finally, we have the data processing phase. Okay, so the image there on the screen is the software that we have to work with that comes with these units, and that's the front end, what it looks like, and we have to interpret and understand and get the machine to learn what noises it's recording. It's not as easy as it sounds, in that a lot of these units have been designed for songbirds. Okay, they're the little passerines, things like pipits and things like that. But strangely enough, things like black swans and especially Canada geese, there isn't a big data set out there for these bits of equipment. Okay, so what we found is that we spent a fair bit of time in the initial phase of this project actually teaching the software what sounds were what, and we've got some examples there. But just going through some of the finalizing with the pros and cons of the ARUs, we've been through the constraints on it on the left, but the pros really come out around cost and time efficiency. Okay, the example being, if you were to do an overnight survey trying to work out flight lines of Canada geese in and around your airfield, or black swans or ducks, wood ducks, Australian wood ducks, excellent work on them for sure, definitely. In person, it's going to take you, if you do 5 days, 12 hours, an hour in the office processing the data, and giving you 61 hours of staff time needed to conduct a nocturnal survey. And you'd probably need infrared equipment as well, which is, as you can imagine, is quite expensive. With an ARU, to achieve the same kind of coverage, you'd need 11 hours. Okay, so the other thing with ARUs is that you can have as many as you want out. Okay, and once you train the software how to identify things, the automation side of it is quick. So there's big efficiencies with some of this stuff around trying to detect these hard to detect high risk species around airfields during low light conditions. Another one is that there's no observer bias or fatigue, and Matt there touched on that a little bit around morphological identification and how it's a dying art. I find that hard to believe because all the people around me look at go around looking at wildlife and things like that. But there we are. It's apparently a dying art. But with this kind of thing, it's very emphatic. It's black and white. It either is or it isn't once you've got your machine working. And this data processing, once you get it automated, it's quick. It's very, very quick. So we'll talk about this project that we had running and still got running down at Auckland, and we're looking at opening it up to Perth Airport potentially as well, as if a need arises. But around down in New Zealand, they've got significant, and especially at Auckland, they've got significant issues with black swans that were reintroduced into New Zealand, and introduced non-native Canada geese. Okay. And there's been a number of strikes, damaging strikes with these species. So there is a real need to understand what's going on with these two species in and around the airport, and trying to develop a targeted management plan. This slide here shows us an aerial view of Auckland Airport there. You can see the main runway there. It's quite obvious, and you can see that a significant part of that airside area is surrounded by intertidal mudflat that's got a lot of migratory shorebirds on it, lots of waterfowl, and some very large numbers of black swans, up to 4,000 black swans. So we designed this project with a view to trying to understand a little bit more the movements of these birds. The red dots indicate known areas for black swans and particularly Canada geese. The orangey coloured circles were likely spots that we thought they could occur, and the yellow spots indicate what we consider to be important areas to know if these high-risk birds are using those areas. So this map shows us where we deployed the ARUs over the course of several months. So once we've got them out, then we'll run through now how you actually go about using this equipment. So we've had our ARUs out in the field for a week, 7 nights, something like that. We've programmed them. They've picked up the information and data that we require. And then we move into the data processing stage. Now, as I've alluded to previously, you need to teach this software exactly what it is it's recording. Okay. And the company that supplies them are really helpful with that. They're a North American based company, but a lot of this research is done around rare breeding birds and things of that nature. So you'd be surprised how little information there is on things like common things like Canada geese and black swans and paradise shell ducks. So we spent quite a bit of time in this initial space teaching the machine how to differentiate between these different sounds. Okay, and surprisingly, if you look at these different charts here, that's the image you get on the screen, and the software will look at the different shapes on there and try and work out what ones are what. So we had to tell the software initially that sound belongs to that animal and that sound belongs to that animal, because in the initial stages the machine was confusing Canada geese with dogs, dog barks and things of that nature. But once we get this, once we've got this sorted out, and it probably took 20 or 30 hours to do that, then that automation process is really quite quick. And you still need to spend, we're still spending time in there, in this space that we've moved away from Canada geese and black swans. Now that we've got that working, we're now teaching the software how to identify the paradise shelducks, which is Australian shelduck over here. So we're working down the risk register with regards to the software for our ARUs, and we're getting more and more information out of it. So this is a typical, as I said, this is what the data comes in, this is what it looks like, and this is what the screen, you can see the picture of the screen there. And there's lots and lots of different pieces of buttons to press and things like that. At this point, I just let the other crew do this, and I get on with other things. But that's typically what a spectrograph will look like, and the machine then analyzes this data here. The machines work really well on high frequency noises. The lower the frequency, the harder the machine actually struggles a little bit to tell the lower frequencies apart. So there's more time that we have to spend in the machine, or did have to spend in the machine, in the software, to get it working. But as I said, it's now up and running, and we're now able to generate reports like this, which the airport has found really, really useful. Okay, and so this was an ARU that was put out for a week on a small island immediately to the south of Auckland Airport, and we were able to calculate that the birds were using this island for quite a narrow period of time, but using it most nights between 12:30 and 5 o'clock in the morning. Okay, they were not present for any other time there. So what they were able to do, the airport, was with this information, they were able to go out there and target these birds for culling, which is what we need to do with a flock of Canada geese on the edge of an airfield and that. So that got them there quite quickly. Once we had got the machines running, taught them what Canada geese sound like, and we're able to build a profile up of where Canada geese use different sites in and around the airfield at different times of day. There's tide issues around there as well. There's some relationship with tides as well. So generally speaking, what we found is that Auckland have been very, very impressed with this stuff, because it's allowed them to target their management and their resources quite specifically. So yeah, just summing this up, what we've done from this project is we've learned about the ecology and movements at Canada geese and black swans around the Auckland Airport. We now know a lot more, and we have enough information to actually target management at them. We've probably used ARU method monitoring technology for the first time in aviation context. We've got a good methodology now for data collection and processing procedures, so that's a nice thing to have. That's generic across the entire use of this equipment. We've made some progress towards automated species recognition, so that's where we teach the equipment what it is. So we're working on that, and we've got a chip away at each species until we get our noise bank, if you like, just like the DNA bank that they have at the museum. And if there's any other ways that you would like that or can think of using this technology at your airports, give us a shout. We'd love to talk to you. I can think of magpie geese straight away. That's something that we're looking at one or two of our airports in northern WA. And certainly wood ducks in the southwest as well. There's some interest in trying to understand that, and the same with whistling ducks. So that's where we are. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Bill. Quite fascinating. We've had generations of people that have been drawn to following, tracing, photographing, and listening to birds. There's hours of recordings on the internet, but combining that and AI to work towards a technological solution for the stuff we've been dealing with since the early 90s is just fascinating. I'm sure there'll be some great questions in the Q&A for you later on, and thanks very much for your time. And we'll hear from you a little bit. Moving on to our next speaker, a topic which is what we've learned from 20 years of bird counts at Melbourne Airport. So a different perspective, another one of our key airports in Australia. We're going to hear now from Dr. William Steele, an ornithologist from Ecology Balance. Over to you, Will.
Thanks very much, Ash, and thank you all for coming to listen. It's a bit of a self-indulgent talk because we've been working at Melbourne Airport for a very long time. I've been involved for 24 years, although not recently. And looking at that length of data, I thought it would be interesting to give a bit of a talk on what we found and some of the high-level long-term trends that we found. So yeah, the aim is just to report on 20 years of bird surveys, 2001 to 2020, and just a bit of a look at the different methods that we've looked at, and then some of the more interesting results. As I say, we've actually been involved since 1997. We've got good count data, but the first 5 years there were a number of people doing it, and so that observer bias might have kicked in. So 2001 to 2020, that I did all of the counts in, so I know that it was pretty standard, hopefully. Why look at bird count methods and results? Bird counts are an absolutely standard requirement to inform risk assessments, and it's pretty much the foundational data on which a lot of the risk assessments are built. And you need that bird information to understand the risk and the factors that are influencing that risk in terms of weather, season, that sort of thing. Bird count data are also essential for measuring the effectiveness of management actions. You know, I'm always struck by everyone who's developed a blooming bird dispersal device. They swear blind that it works perfectly, that it'll get rid of all the birds for you. And if you believe them and you didn't actually have that bird count data to be able to show clearly and in a data-driven way whether they are having an effect on the bird numbers in the long term, you know, you'd be spending a lot of money buying all this equipment that a lot of it's not that effective. And one of the things, the but there was, you know, bird ecological data are highly variable, highly periodic, and so you need a lot of data collection in order to pick up real trends, to get that to pick up those patterns that are not just the background noise and the variation because of the wind direction or the air temperature. The first method that was used for the bulk of the time, and this I think is what's used at quite a number of airports now, is you really want to get a picture of the whole airside and the surrounding area, and you just want those basic questions of what species are attracted, which of those are the high risk ones, why are they attracted, how many of them are attracted, what time of day are they coming over, as Bill was saying. So you just want that holistic picture of the airport. And for that, so for 17 years, we did basic standardized fixed route surveys, which is a fixed route around the airport, fixed time of day, fixed points to stop and listen and watch for birds. And to be honest, it is quite difficult because it's like 750 to 800 hectares, so it's a large site. But more importantly, it's a heck of a busy and difficult place to drive around and be trying to do bird counts, and you can't always stop where you'd like to stop to get the best views of areas. So it's a big area, and it's a difficult area to do bird surveys on, essentially. But what we did was weekly and then later monthly fixed route surveys, recording all birds seen on a 200 meter by 200 meter grid, and getting that survey done within 3 hours after sunrise. And I should say, because I'm sure the question will come up, oh, what about night? We obviously did night observations as well. And we also tried morning, noon, evening counts. I'm really just focusing on the morning counts because those were the most important in my view, and those are the ones we've got the longest data sets for. So this fixed route survey, 200 meter by 200 meter grid, trying to do it within 3 hours after, to complete it within 3 hours after sunrise, and in amongst all the aircraft movements. That gave us very detailed, good picture of, you know, what species, as I say, those basic questions of what species were there, what the attractions were. And I won't go into all of that in 15 minutes. Obviously, we don't have a lot of time to talk about the detailed results. It's more, this bit is just, I'm interested in the bird count methods and the different results we obtained. After 17 years of that whole of airport data, which is limited because as I say, it's a big site and you've got a very limited time, and you've got all these distractions. I then moved to trying to do more detailed counts at fixed points. And so we selected 6 good vantage points where we got really good views, a 400 meter radius circle. That's about the absolute limit of binoculars for, I know a lot of ecologists would say you can't observe things at 400 meters accurately. But if you think the airport stuff, we were really interested in the large species or the flocking species. And so I think 400 meters, you could pick up decent, you know, you're getting that risk, the high risk species. We did this fortnightly. We'd increased the number of counts to fortnightly, and doing 15 minutes per point. So changing from a fixed route survey method to a fixed point survey method. It's just interesting. I tried to plot, you know, we say 400 meter radius, but in fact with dead ground and dips in the ground and buildings and trees, you're actually not covering that entire area in any way. And so those 6 points were basically giving us that about half of the airside coverage. So not too bad, but not great. Because we were worried about not getting quite enough coverage, we then moved to methods 3 and 4. And method 3, we went to 12 points around the airport, reduced the radius a little bit, and reduced the time to try and get around 12 points 3 hours after sunrise. You had to reduce the timing quite a bit. And this method, the method 3, is very much like the American method advertised as I explained in one of the books by DeVault, I think it is, where they have 200 meter radius and only 3-minute counts, which I don't think is enough. But and they try to get up to 20 points around an airport. So this is, you know, it has been used overseas. I found the 5 minutes too short, and so we then increased the duration to 10 minutes, and we had to reduce the number of points to only 9. And so we've got those 4 different count methods: fixed route, and then 3 fixed point ones, with the fixed points changing in terms of the number of them and the duration you spend at each one. And the results are, so along the bottom, we've got method 1, 2, 3, 4. Method 1 was the fixed route looking at the whole of airport. 2, 3, and 4 were the fixed point surveys. And looking at the number of species you record using those different methods. Method 1 was the best, and you'd think that's the case because you're actually checking the entire airport and getting into some areas maybe of buildings where you get sparrows or pigeons or things that you're not going to find in some of the other areas. So the fixed route was the most comprehensive species list. But if you look at method 4, we were actually getting, you know, very similar results. And so method 4 was to me was the best balance between getting detailed information but an adequate cover of the airport. You see, method 2, sorry, we by only covering about half the airfield, we weren't actually getting the species up there. And method 3, I think we were covering a lot of the airfield, but we weren't actually getting the same number of species. And that to me was that very short duration at each site. So 5 minutes, by the time you've driven up, established yourself and done your 5-minute count, it's only then that the birds are starting to respond to the quietness again. So you do, by having that 5-minute count, you do miss out a lot of species. And not a lot, but you do miss species. In terms of just overall bird numbers counted, obviously the 800 meter 800 hectare full airport thing, we were getting the highest number of birds. Again, method 2 was just really not good enough. You're getting very low numbers of birds. You were only doing about half of the airfield, so it's not quite as bad as it looks. That's comparing the area covered. But again, methods 3 and 4, I think, were the best balance of the accuracy of count and the comprehensiveness of the count. And so, yeah, method 1 gives them the best spatial coverage, but you'll notice that very high variability as well in the number of birds counted using that, trying to do that fixed route whole of airport. And method 4, again, it was getting a lot of birds. And in terms of, if you're thinking of the 250 birds per 350 hectares versus 380 birds over 800 hectares, it was actually giving you a more comprehensive and a more accurate count of what birds were really there. The 800 hectare count was not giving you that same level of accuracy. So, I mean, they're very simple conclusions, but the fixed route with the complete coverage gives the best overall picture of the airside, and that was essential to build up that picture of what species are appearing when and where and why, because that is your risk, that's your risk profile, and that will inform your management. But in terms of actual detailed information, the fixed point counts provide better spatial discrimination because you can target them. I should have mentioned, we did target them in areas where we were doing specific management interventions, such as insecticide spraying or trying grass trials. So the fixed point counts were giving you a detailed picture of a much smaller area, which was of importance in terms of comparing management effort. And the fixed point, it was important to be definitely longer than 5 minutes. With 5 minutes was not giving you was not showing you all the birds that were in that area, because as you were arriving, a lot of them were moving aside. So fairly simple conclusion. I should say although I'm obviously pushing, I think the fixed point counts were more accurate. The fixed route, that whole of airside count, was absolutely essential in giving us the risk profile and describing the overall risk. The fixed point counts were better if evaluating the effectiveness of management interventions. This is just a caution. I was quite struck by this. The blue line at the top, that's the mean number of birds per year across the 20-year or 17-year period we're just looking at method 1. And then the number of common starlings, the entire, practically half the bird population is common starlings. And so if you did analysis on the total number of birds, and you're really only looking at the starlings are such a huge influence on that, you're really only measuring changes in starling numbers in some ways. You have to be careful to make sure that you are looking at all individual species as well. Because there's just a almost perfect correlation between trends in starling numbers and trends in the mean number of birds. One of the most interesting things, and I think it's obvious, but it's interesting to me to see it displayed so prominently, is if you look at feeding guilds of birds, and the codes here might look a bit gobbledygook, but it's basically whether they are insectivorous ground foraging birds or granivorous ground foraging birds or omnivorous ground foraging birds. And then you go into the aerial feeders or the carnivores or other feeding guilds. But these top 3 guilds, with the GR for ground foraging is the third, they comprise 95% of all the birds counted over that entire period. I mean, 95% of all birds counted were ground foraging individuals. They weren't water birds or shrub foragers or woodland birds or carnivores, or 95% ground foraging birds. And these are just to give you an example of, the Ingra, the ground foraging insectivores. You've got the lapwing, a lot of high risk species at Melbourne Airport, lapwing, magpie, starling. The granivores are also largely high risk species because they are flocking and dense bodied. So you've got the rock dove, galahs and corellas. And the omnivores, by that we lumped the ravens, but also the ibis. I mean, strictly speaking, at Melbourne Airport, the ibis are probably only feeding on insects, but they're traditionally typed as omnivores. So it's just I don't know if there's a correlation there that the majority of birds are ground foraging and the majority of high risk species are ground foraging. And so that is something I had been banging on about. I think the management of grasslands is still the big gap in a lot of Australian airport management. You know, we can manage the water, we can manage the mammals, we can manage birds that are attracted to buildings or perches. We can do a lot of that. I think, and we've done a lot of that. But this getting good pasture management to reduce broadleaf weed cover, to reduce insect numbers, that really is to me the big, like the holy grail. If you can find some way to manage those open grassland areas that don't attract large numbers of birds, that would be a huge step forward. And then just a quick look at the some of the, as I say, this is a bit of a self-indulgent talk. It's just things that I found interesting, but they do relate to your risk management in a way. And looking at the guild, so this is the ground foraging granivores, the corellas, galahs, pigeons, those sorts of things. There's across the bottom here are months of the year, so January to December, and you'll see that there are clear seasonal peaks when these things are most abundant. And compare that to the carnivores, the birds of prey, who are much more common at the airport in summer. And that's the sort of thing we know, obviously, I think after a little bit of watching, but it's good to have the data to show just how clear those seasonal trends are. And that does have implications for risk, but also your risk management. If you are targeting carnivores, birds of prey in the summer months, and then moving to granivores in the winter months, that I think is useful information. And then these I just thought interesting because it's just the examples of how clear that seasonality is. Very, very much lower numbers because we don't have a lot of piscivores. That's fish-eating birds, which are mainly cormorants, and the shrub layer insectivores, so the small robins and things like that. Just such clear seasonality to their presence at the airport. Okay, annual rainfall. This is just looking at annual rainfall, total annual rainfall with total number of birds. And you'd think that that would have a major impact on, a major influence on bird numbers, but in fact, there's not a statistically significant correlation with rainfall, which did surprise me because I did think that would be one of the driving forces. Looking at it by species, annual rainfall was positively correlated with little raven and magpie lark for some reason. And the 12-month antecedent rainfall for black kite, which is interesting. That black kite's one of the more arid zone species that moves down, and so presumably they breed up during a good rainfall year and then move down to the coast, or can move down to the coast. A much stronger correlation, and a statistically significant one, was the number of birds with mean annual temperature, and it was an inverse relationship. So the hotter the year, the lower the number of birds. Bit of drought in arid zone species. This is just showing the millennial drought broke about here, and towards the end of the drought we were getting these really arid zone species. Zebrafinch and crested pigeon moved in, and zebrafinch have persisted and carried on. Crested pigeons are barely hanging on. Those are real arid zone species, and they did move in during the millennium drought. Second last slide, trends in high risk species. This is the number of magpies. There's a statistically significant correlation that the number of time with numbers, and that to me is a clear evidence, because that has been enemy number one at Melbourne Airport for quite a while, and that has been the focus of a lot of the management. And that statistically significant decline, I think, is a good news. It's good evidence that some of that management is having effect. Similarly, ibis have been really targeted, and it was good to see that they, see those numbers really drop off and not come up again. A contrast is the raven, which, as I think most people would know, ravens are difficult to manage. We haven't had much effect on the raven numbers. Looking at by guild, just the ground foraging insectivores in blue, there's been that steep decline, which is great because they have been the focus of management. The aerial feeders, so the swallows and martins, they're really not amenable to management, and we haven't had much effect on their numbers. But worryingly, the number of ground foraging granivores, particularly rock doves, is going up. And so they obviously must be a focus. And thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Will. So I've been across the Tasman. We've come across Australia down on our south coast in Melbourne. Very shortly, we're going to head across to Perth and have perspective there. I've just been informed by the team that there has been some comms issues with people in various locations around the place. We're not sure, although there's a suspicion that it's possibly linked also to the failures that have occurred on various social media platforms today. So whilst it's not in our control, I do apologise to anybody in the audience who's had any breaks in audio or visual. I can assure you, though, too, that all registered participants, recording will be made available to watch of the entire session after it's finished, as well as it will be for the subsequent webinars as well. Additionally, I think there was been some confusion or miscommunication with reference time zones and that dreaded time of the year when we switch to daylight saving in parts of Australia and other parts don't. So my apologies again for people that may have missed the early parts of it with the changeover, but again, the recordings will be available for you later on. Okay, moving on to our next presenter, and welcoming back onto the stage Bill Rutherford from Ornithological Technical Services to have a look at IBIS management and IBIS work at Perth Airport. Over to you, Bill. Thanks.
Can you all hear me? Yes? Thanks, Ash. So very quickly, we're going to tell you some of the things we've been doing with our old friends Australian white ibis on this side of the country. There's a couple of things here specific to the airport, and then generally over the metro area here in Perth. So we all know why they're a pest. We have them doing this sort of stuff here as well. I'm sure you have it over there as well. And they are an aviation strike risk. So that's why we've been looking at them over the last few years with some detail. And we've tried to have to develop short and medium term solutions to our IBIS issues here in the metro area. And we've looked at some of the long-term solutions as well and how we're going to go about managing that. And we've realised that we need to know a lot more about our IBIS for us to develop those long-term solutions. So we're going to look at two things in particular. We're going to look at the management project based at Perth Airport, which is in a wetland that adjoins as part of the airport estate called Monday Swamp. It's a very important wetland from a nature conservation point of view, and also very, very important from a cultural point of view. So that can put constraints on management of any species when you have those conservation and cultural issues going on at the same time. We're also going to look finally at the Australian white ibis satellite tracking program, which finished a couple of years ago now, but we've had problems trying to get the data with regards to releasing the data, but everyone's on board with it now, so we are allowed to talk about that particular very interesting satellite tracking project that we run. We'll kick off with the airport management works. First of all, the breeding colony of Australian white ibis located on the Perth Airport estate. That slide there shows you Perth Airport as it stands at the moment. The estate is highlighted in red, and Monday Swamp is the wetland with the boundary, the yellow boundary on it. And our routine bird monitoring risk-based surveys detected increasing numbers of ibis, and this is some time ago now, 10 years ago at least, and they were centered in certain parts of the airfield, or the data was coming in from certain count sites. So we decided to investigate that target, do some targeted surveys, and we found a very healthy breeding colony of Australian white ibis in Monday Swamp. Okay, so a major concern, very high risk species, very close to the existing runways, and the new runway that's being built, or that's in the process of being started now. The actual northern end of that runway will be just shy of the southernmost part of Monday Swamp. So we're going to have of a very important wetland right at the end of the new runway that's already got a very big, or did have a very big Australian white ibis breeding colony extant. And the management project started in 2014. Okay. The aim of the project was to prevent successful breeding attempts on a long-term basis. Okay, so we couldn't remove the habitat. That wasn't an option for conservation and cultural issues. That we can't intervene in any way in that respect. So we've got to target the actual birds. Okay, and that involved a comprehensive search on each visit every 2 weeks to the swamp and the removal of nests and eggs. Okay. This slide shows you some of the typical, the squiggly lines that you can see on there are GPS trackers that show you the routes that the ATS ornithologists took, checking all the potential breeding areas for these birds. There's a strong correlation with ibis of them nesting over water. Okay, so these are the paperbark swamp, Melaleuca trees. And the ibis target those trees that are over water. They won't nest in trees that are over land. That gave us significant challenges in how we go about managing those birds, because initially we thought we'd be doing egg oiling, but we couldn't do it. Actually getting the oil up into the nests was difficult. We did find a way around it, but we would have had to use so much oil that there'd be pollution issues in the swamp. So we removed nests and eggs, and we use a video inspection camera on a pole to check the contents to see what's in there and then act accordingly. What we've shown is that we've managed to achieve a significant reduction in nests, eggs, and chicks. Okay, so remember the outcome was to stop production from that colony of birds, chicks fledging. So that slide says it all, really. We were alarmed when we found the colony, but happy that our detection methods worked, our risk-based monitoring worked, and we got onto it, and we've managed to achieve a really good outcome. Interestingly, last year, we did detect a slight increase in nests, which related to an increase in eggs as well. And we think that's probably due to the fact that there's now other ibis control programs operating in Perth that we run ourselves, and we think that what's happened is some of the ibis have moved from other colonies into our colony. But fortunately, we've managed, and importantly, to stay on top of the black line, which is the number of chicks fledged. Okay, so they haven't fledged any chicks from that colony since 2017, which is the big outcome. And we need to do that because eventually we're going to, the birds will run out of life, if you like. The pairs that use that colony show a very strong site, what we call site fidelity. So they'll keep going back. Those adults that were born, that were initially born in this colony, will keep going back to that colony. We're not sure if it's the males or the females or both. We don't know enough about that yet, about ibis in general. But the important thing is that there's nothing new coming out of the colony. So eventually the colony will wear itself out. Okay, but we've got to stay on top of it. And this slide here shows some of the data around our risk-based surveys, the kind of things that Will was talking about just a moment ago. And we're finding that fewer birds are being detected airside. Okay, as a result, we suggest of the works that are going on in Monday Swamp. But we have got that one in 2020, which that slight peak there, which again relates to an influx of birds from other unsuccessful colonies coming into our colony. But again, no chicks, and it's satisfying to know that the detection, that the methodology around detecting risks, the generic ones that we use, works as well. All right, so that's more or less it on the ibis management at Perth Airport. We'll talk a little bit now about the satellite tracking that was very interesting, the results that came out of this. So as with all projects, and if you use your ornithologists and things like that and your biologists, and you're going to start doing targeted management, you need to spend a good bit of time sitting down at the beginning of your project and working out what it is you want to do, what it is you want to achieve, what questions you have, and how you're going to get your answers. So we actually formed a Australian White Ibis Management Committee with some of the metropolitan regional councils around Perth, because they've got issues with them at their rubbish tips, landfill sites. So the questions we asked at the beginning was, why do we want to track ibis? That's the question. We want to know about the home range and movements, the habitat preferences of ibis, and the site preferences of ibis, and that would go on to inform our management decisions, how we're going to target management. To that end, we fitted 4 ibis with trackers, 2 at Tamala Park landfill, which is in northern part of Perth, and 2 at the Red Hill landfill, which is on the eastern side of Perth, which is visible from the airport, that one. Now, we used solar powered GPS GSM trackers, and they work off the mobile telephone networks. Okay, so that's quite a relatively inexpensive way of achieving some of these outcomes. The other alternative would have been to use the Argus satellite tracker. There's all kinds of issues around that with regards to size and welfare issues on birds and cost. It's very expensive to do it that. So this was a relatively inexpensive way of getting to where we wanted to be with regards to answers to the questions. This is a lovely map that shows the home range and some of the movements of these ibis. The red dots relate to the Red Hill birds, and the pink dots relate to the Red Hill birds. So that's where the rubbish tip, the landfill site, is up there, and the airport. We've got some better views of the airport, but the airport's in there. The other 2 ibis were at Tamala Park landfill site. That's at the top end, the northern end, top left-hand corner of the slide. You see, for some reason, those birds moved around quite a bit. And this is what we come up with, was that the home range size and region varied with capture location. So it seems that there's something about the Red Hill birds that they stay up there in that general area. It's probably that they've got enough of what they need. Or there could be other reasons that we don't understand as yet. The Tamala Park birds, the blue and the yellow, they moved around a lot more for some reason. We don't know yet. I'm not in the position where we can give answers to any of this, but we've documented it and we understand that some of them do move, some don't. Okay, the home ranges varied by season and they varied by rainfall. Okay, so seems that there was a movement to areas that had received rainfall recently as opposed to those that hadn't, and there was a strong correlation as well, particularly with the blue and the yellow birds. Tamala Park birds were between their feeding areas and their breeding areas. They would commute daily, 15 kilometers, something like that, to a feeding area and back to the breeding area. So the average daily movement for ibis was between 11.3 to 24.7 kilometers, which is higher than the that found in the 1990 study of ibis in Sydney. Okay, so that was one of the big differences between the western ones and the eastern ones. And we found also that occasionally this number yellow, ibis number 1, done these long hops as well. And that long hop, if you've ever been over here, this is Perth at the top with Rottnest Island there, and that bit down at the bottom, that's the kind of Margaret River, Dunsborough area where everyone goes drinking wine and things like that. But this ibis done a jaunt down there for a week and came back, and every dot relates to either a landfill site, a transfer station, or a wetland. Okay, so that's what they like. So ibis spent most of their time in a few core locations. That's the entire data set. There is some stuff taken out. And we've got the Red Hill one, that bottom left dot, that's in Monday Swamp. So it wasn't breeding in Monday Swamp, but it did go to Monday Swamp. Middle Swan, Red Hill, Herdsman Lake, you can see that there's strong correlation in these birds here. What we found is that the ibis very rarely move between the core locations. Okay, so the Red Hill birds stayed at Red Hill, the Tambler Park birds stayed at Tambler Park and Herdsman Lake, and there's Perth Airport. What we found around activities and resource use was that wetland sites preferred for roosting and nesting, landfill and wetland sites preferred for foraging, and seasonal and individual variation occurred over all species. So the management implications that wetlands and landfills are priorities for management, and spatial scale and context are important. The outcomes of a detailed study of an ibis movement results in full management. Certain habitats are priorities, spatial scale and context. Few birds in the colony, Perth Airport, few birds breed successfully, fewer breeding attempts, fewer birds seen around airport. Sorry, there we are. 17 minutes.
Thanks, Bill. And thanks for that very interesting perspective on the and for those that don't know, there's already been some discussion over here in Southeast Queensland with a suggestion that the ibis should be the mascot for the 2032 Southeast Queensland Olympics. I don't know if that'll get up or not, but only time will tell, I guess. Okay, so we've hit the West Coast. We're going to turn right now and head up north. Our next presentations is from a combined team effort. We've got Nick Bluer, Mike Clancy and Nick Fuster from Darwin International Airport. And we're going to talk about Don't Feed the Birds, reducing wildlife food sources at Darwin International Airport. Handing over, team.
Thanks very much, Ash. And yeah, really pleased to be with you here today. I'm talking to you from the Gold Coast, and Mike Clancy and Nick Fuster are coming in from Darwin. So we've got a full Australian perspective. As you've mentioned, Ash, our presentation today is Don't Feed the Birds, but importantly, the subtitle is about reducing wildlife food sources at Darwin International Airport, and doing that through management of the grassland. So I'll hand over to my co-presenters now, Nick Fuster and Mike Clancy, just to set the perspective of the challenge at Darwin International Airport.
Right, thank you, Nick. So I'm Nick also, Nick Fuster, Environment and Sustainability Manager for NT Airports, and with me is Mike Clancy, the Airside Operations Manager for NT Airports. Over the next few slides, we just want to set the scene, I guess, and provide some context about what Darwin feels and looks like from the perspective of wildlife hazard management. So a few points here. We live in a tropical monsoon climate. We've just had our first significant rain of about 20 mils. We're right in the thick of the build-up, and then we'll be getting some really significant rain, most likely December, January and February, when most of that rainfall occurs. We nearly get 2 metres of rainfall per year. So it's a unique climate that attracts plenty of an abundance of wildlife around the airside areas and Darwin generally. We're also a 24-hour operation, which brings in nighttime species as well around airside areas, and we're a joint user with Defence, who operate just on the other side of the runway from where the airport's based. And over the period of 2006 to 2015, we were recorded in Australia as having the highest strike rate, which is a very significant thing to have and a big challenge to work with. Next slide, please, Nick. So a few snapshots here. Our stakeholders are very interested in bird strike in Darwin, so they're definitely internal stakeholders and all of our airside operators, but also the general community as well. Sometimes that's positive news, but often it can be negative too. So a few snapshots there of what the media's come back to us with. Mike and I were very fortunate earlier this year on having a feature story with ABC News about how we manage wildlife, and that was a bold move for us, a bit shy to involve camera crew to airside areas, but really good to get on the front foot and to guide that story rather than having some clickbait come up instead. It was good to manage that issue. Next slide, please. So a quick snapshot here. Again, this is quite an old photo, but just summarising that the strikes are significant, between 70 to 100 per strikes on average historically per year. And that shot shows a mowing event just out the front of the old terminal, and a whole lot of kites circling around looking for protein, lizards and so forth that might be scurrying around the mower. And so that's definitely an event that can happen when it coincides with mowing. Next slide, please. And really summarising that it's a very serious issue. Obviously, aviation safety, the financial and operational issue, and the environmental issue, and the community concern that comes out of all of that. So a big issue for Darwin that we're very focused on looking at trying to manage proactively, and our strike rate there a little over 11 per 10,000 aircraft movements over that decade period. So Mike, I'll just hand over to you now.
Yeah, next slide, thanks Nick. Yeah, as we've mentioned there, as you can see that we had probably averaging around about 80 to 90 confirmed strikes per year over that 10-year period, and around about 11 per 10,000 movements. So basically, except for environmental factors that that can influence our strikes from year to year, such as the weather can affect what migratory species arrive, which of course then has a direct effect on strike numbers. But basically, the historical data shows there was little change in the strikes, and our active management, which are using pyrotechnics, live rounds, that sort of thing, really didn't have a long-term effect. Obviously, it managed the immediate effect, but it didn't have or impact, but it didn't have a long-term impact. Yeah, so next slide, Nick. Yeah, so as I said, despite the active management strategies, which included obviously our patrols, use of pyrotechnics and other scare devices, shooting and culling, our strike rate still remained high. We maintained active management 24/7 throughout the COVID period so that we didn't get birds habituate for when the aircraft movement started to increase. But we needed to look at something different, and so what to do? Over to you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks, Mike, for setting the scene there. So I think, as grass management consultants, what our perspective is that Darwin really sought an unconventional and innovative approach, which was quite courageous, and as Bill and Will have mentioned in their presentations, it's really about a data-driven decision making. So I suppose a quick understanding of what is integrated vegetation management, and this really is it in a nutshell, that it's the complementary strategies for managing vegetation in the most economically, socially, and environmentally responsible way. What does that really mean? It's a really simple aim, and that's utilising grass management technology and to make the airport as unattractive to wildlife as possible by minimising wildlife food sources. So it's about passive management or proactive management, in other words. So this producer-consumer food pyramid kind of sums it up nicely. And obviously we're well aware of the risks of the tertiary and secondary consumers here in this food pyramid. And you know, they're obviously and rightly so the key focus of active wildlife management. But I think what's less understood is from our experiences the primary consumers, and really where our experience is in managing the producers here in this food pyramid, which is the grassland, and importantly its interaction with the consumers. And another way to look at that is with this food web here, which we can see that there's obviously an interaction there with seed feeders, but perhaps what's what has previously been less well known is the interaction with things like caterpillars, and then their relationship with predatory species like mud daubing wasps. And I was interested to hear about that in the earlier presentation from the museum. And then also, obviously, they then turn into adults, and then the relationship between those with other consumers and so forth. So importantly here, though, in this food web, you can see that the grassland is really the key component that all producers, that all consumers rather, have a relationship with. So what to do with that perspective? And this case study at Darwin Airport's really been really interesting. I mean, it's 4 years worth of work to get to this point now. And so the background there is following a successful trial in the 2018-19 financial year. The first step was conducting a vegetation species survey of the high-risk areas of the airport. And the data from that survey provided a unique understanding of which species were acting as wildlife food sources, and importantly, attracting birds airside. So what we can see here is one of the heat maps from that vegetation species survey, and the darker areas, importantly, is where in this heat map, where the high density of undesirable grasses were present. But we did this for all individual species, and then grouped those into undesirable and desirable composition. What was really important here, and the important insight, was that the darker areas were with the higher risk areas, of course, with aircraft movement, landing and takeoff. So this was segmented and then compared with other site-specific data to really inform a program. But what you can see here, some on-the-ground photos there at the time of the vegetation species survey. You can see some high biomass grasses here on the left of screen, and the broadleaf species, which we know are insect attracting species as well, and ergo are a risk for birds. So utilising that, we developed an integrated vegetation management program, and that commenced in October last year. You can see here highlighted the areas of the program areas, the high risk areas, and they total around 90 hectares in total on those blue areas there. So the aim, as we mentioned, was reducing the presence of birds in the vegetated high risk areas close to the main runway where aircraft take off and land. And a secondary aim of the program is improving the quality of the vegetation through the reduction of declared weed species and the promotion of lower growing, more manageable grasses, and that's an important secondary aim. So if we look here at the elements of the program, Obviously, the species survey and the analysis of the data from that is important, but also then the agronomic assessment. There's been staff training and workshops with the DIA staff and also the contractor who is doing the application. You can see there in this slide the contractor that carried out the spray application treatments as part of this program. And those applications involved selective and site-specific insect and weed control, targeted obviously based on what we found during the survey, and then ongoing scientific monitoring as part of the program. I'd like to acknowledge our scientist, Dr. Sheldon Navy, who did all of the assessment and the survey work on ground at DIA. So if we look here, Mike and Nick, you might like to comment on the risk management elements there from the stakeholders' perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. As you mentioned, there was a 4-year process. We initially started engaging with Defence some time ago, but I guess in the early days we didn't get a lot of buy-in. So the trial that we conducted was on the DIA lease area. So we had a treated site and an untreated site where we did regular surveys, and that was, I guess, some of the training for our staff to do the counts and surveys of birds and insects to get the data so that we could actually demonstrate to Defence and other stakeholders that, you know, we believe this was a good process and a practical application that we could hopefully reduce wildlife on the airfield and then hence reduce wildlife strikes. So I might hand over to Nick Fuster now, who was really integral in getting our stakeholders on board.
Well, I guess both of us sitting here is a really good indicator that we were both very connected with the project. I'd suggest anyone embarking on a project like this have two people working closely together that can influence and drive and work as a tag team to influence your internal stakeholders and also the external stakeholders. The risk management around safety and environment really came together in the trial. As Mike said, it was a smaller area, about 2 hectares, which was a great training ground because we needed to consider the what-ifs. For example, what if the selective herbicide wiped out too much of the vegetation cover and created dust issues or erosion issues? What if the insecticide could kill all the insects at once, which then creates a mass bird feeding event? What if birds that move out because it's less desirable then allow other bird species to move in? So the trial was a great way to introduce people, including Darwin RAF, who are a main stakeholder, build confidence and good data with our staff, and doing some good risk management as well to then have the confidence to push the button and do the 90 hectare round the runway project. Yeah, there are some surprising stakeholders as well. The Rapid Creek Water Advisory Committee were very interested in what we were doing because we're within the Rapid Creek catchment area, a very important catchment with a lot of native flora and fauna. So the toxicity of the products being used was assessed. Fortunately, it was very low, but we had very strict procedures around if rain is approaching or if there's a rain event to manage the situation so we don't have any wash off of product going into the waterways. That was a really key aspect. And yeah, I'll reiterate the trial and having 2 members within the organisation that are really supporting each other and pushing it throughout to all the other stakeholders as needed. Over to you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks very much, guys. And so just quickly, obviously success management was super important, and so it's all about data-driven decision making. So these are the elements that were recorded: insect monitoring accounts, the vegetation assessments, wildlife harassment data that's being recorded by the DIA personnel, bird count and wildlife strike data, and the tracker airside observation entries for wildlife. And so we've just commenced year 2 of the multi-year program, but what we'll present now is the results from year 1. And this slide summarizes those results. Keep in mind, this is 1 year of data, and this is compared with the previous 3 years of data. So 1 year of data compared with the previous 3 years. But obviously, we're very we're very pleased with the first year's results, and key for that really is the reduction in bird strike, which is obviously where the rubber meets the road, and a 57% reduction. So just looking at just quickly at the individual graphs here, you can see grasshopper activity. So what we know is there was a 97% reduction in grasshopper activity in the treated area compared with the control or untreated area. And you can see here the timing influence for the 2 applications that were applied in that 12-month period. You can see here the desirable and acceptable grass cover increase in the treated compared to the untreated, and you can also see here the impact on the monthly bird count here, again compared with the 3-year average. And the monthly bird harassment data again shows a similar positive trend. What's interesting is that we know that the ammunition usage, there was a significant, almost a 50% reduction there in the 12 months in ammunition usage. And here you can see again the bird strike data reflected in from the green line being the year just gone, and the red line being the previous 3 years. And finally, the bird cull data, you can see here in the individual species, the change there. So Australian pratten culls were the only species to increase in that 12 months. Overall, there was a 69% increase in that year compared with the 3-year previous. That's us. Thank you very much. Thanks, Nick and Mike, as well. Terrific, guys.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thanks, Team Darwin International, noting that some of you are coming from the Gold Coast as well as we speak. Fantastic presentation. I noticed a few times there you use the term, data-driven decision-making, but I'd also hazard to point out that it's just a fantastic and practical example of risk-based management of change, and the sorts of outcomes that we want to see within an effective safety management system. So congratulations, guys. Excellent presentation. Where's 2 hours gone? I guess we're coming towards the end now. We're entering our portion of the program, which is our Q&A. We've got, I think, while I madly switch between screens here, we've got 4 questions that have come in. And I think if Catherine in the background has been getting everything lined up for me. The first question we've got that's come in that we're going to look to answer is from Peter Raven. Peter asked, what education material is provided to alert? That's not what we're going to do first, but I'll do that one because I'm going to answer it. To provide alert damage caused by feral pigs, goats, rabbits, and the like at remote landing areas and airports, and the potential damage to aircraft if one of these animals is struck on takeoff or landing. It's a fantastic question, Peter, and it's one of those ones that I guess in some ways it's that wicked problem. There is no perfect answer for it. Most of these regional and particularly the remote landing strips you're talking about are in many ways unregulated or minimally regulated due to the nature of what they are. And in this age, it would also be probably regarded as regulatory overreach to go and stipulate all sorts of measures that would need to be in place at these, because these small regional councils and entities just would not be able to put these in place. What I guess it does bring back to for me though is the shared responsibility, shared outcome type of perspective. So for operators operating into these locations, they need to be as well briefed on what to expect on the ground at these airfields as they do in getting briefed on the weather. So they need to be contacting these ports. They need to be aware that they're unfenced, for instance, so that they don't just come in off a long final to land and possibly encounter a pig on the runway.